Hello and welcome to 10 Minutes On. This week we're looking at the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, if you're listening to this in Europe, North America, or elsewhere outside Africa, you might assume this is a regional health story with limited global relevance. But that would be a mistake. Because this outbreak is taking place at the intersection of three trends that extend far beyond Central Africa: the persistence of deadly infectious diseases, the consequences of armed conflict, and the retreat of international humanitarian assistance. In other words, this is not simply a story about a virus. It is a story about what happens when a dangerous virus emerges in one of the most difficult environments imaginable, just as many of the systems designed to contain it have been weakened. The latest figures from the World Health Organization indicate that more than 900 suspected cases and over 220 suspected deaths in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In neighboring Uganda, authorities have reported more than 130 confirmed cases and 18 deaths. And those numbers may yet change significantly. Part of the challenge is that many of the cases remain classified as suspected rather than confirmed. Samples must often be transported to laboratories in Kinshasa, nearly 1,000 kilometers away from the epicenter of the outbreak. Poor roads, weak infrastructure, and insecurity all contribute to delays. At the same time, health authorities are attempting to trace thousands of people who may have come into contact with infected individuals. Every day that passes before those contacts are located increases the risk of further transmission. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, the World Health Organization Director General traveled to Bunia, the capital of Ituri province, at the weekend and the center of the outbreak. His visit was intended both to demonstrate international support and to understand directly from the local communities what assistance is required. The European Union and the United States have announced additional funding for the response, amounting to around $112 million. Yet this highlights a wider problem. Although the emergency funding attracts headlines, broader international support for healthcare systems across Africa have been falling. Between 2021 and 2025, assistance from Europe and the United States reportedly declined by half. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, American funding had previously accounted for a significant share of the humanitarian spending, and much of that support has now been reduced or withdrawn. So the timing could not be worse. And to understand why, it helps to understand Ebola itself. Ebola is a viral hemorrhagic disease that typically begins with symptoms that resemble flu: fever, headaches, fatigue, and muscle pain. As the disease progresses, patients may experience vomiting, diarrhea, and severe dehydration. In the most serious cases, multiple organs begin to fail. Symptoms usually appear between 2 and 21 days after infection. The virus is believed to originate in animals before spreading to humans through contact through infected wildlife. Once human transition begins, the disease spreads through direct contact with bodily fluids from infected individuals. Not all Ebola outbreaks are the same. There are several strains of the virus. The current outbreak involves the Bundibugyo strain, for which there is no approved vaccine currently available. And that matters. The mortality rate associated with Bundibugyo Ebola is generally lower than that of some other strains. Previous outbreaks have produced fatality rates of around 1/3 of cases, although the World Health Organization believes that the rate could rise to between 40 and 50% as this outbreak develops. By comparison, the Zaire strain has recorded mortality rates as high as 90% in some outbreaks. Even so, a disease capable of killing 1 in every 3 infected individuals remains an extremely serious threat. And the World Health Organization has classified the situation as a public health emergency of international concern. That designation reflects not only the severity of the disease itself, but also the conditions in which it is spreading. And this is where the story becomes particularly worrying. The outbreak's epicenter is in Ituri province, a region that has experienced decades of violence. Multiple armed groups operate there, ethnic militias compete for territory and influence, and the Allied Democratic Forces, an organization linked to the Islamic State, also maintains a presence. The World Health Organization has called for humanitarian access and temporary ceasefires to support disease control efforts. But whether such appeals will succeed is another matter. Armed groups rarely suspend military operations simply because international organizations ask them to do so. Conflict transforms what would already be a difficult public health challenge into something far more complicated. Healthcare workers face security risks, roads become inaccessible, communities become harder to reach. And rumors spread more easily than reliable information. Populations on the move are difficult to monitor. Around 900,000 displaced people are currently living in Ituri alone. Many reside in overcrowded camps where sanitation is limited and healthcare services are already overstretched. These conditions are almost ideal for accelerating disease transmission. And nor is the outbreak confined to a single province. Cases have been reported in North and South Kivu, regions that have experienced intense fighting and where parts of the territory are controlled by the M23 rebellion rather than the government in Kinshasa. And that creates an obvious challenge. The international response is largely organized through national authorities. But disease does not recognize political boundaries, front lines, or competing claims to authority. Containing an outbreak requires cooperation across territories controlled by actors who are often actively fighting one another. So that it's easier to say than to achieve. So what is the risk of Ebola spreading beyond Central and East Africa? At present, most experts believe the likelihood of a wider international outbreak remains low. Uganda has imposed restrictions at its border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Other countries, including the United States and Canada, have introduced additional screening or travel-related measures. There have been isolated cases involving individuals who travelled outside the region, including humanitarian personnel who are now receiving treatment abroad. However, unlike COVID-19, Ebola is not transmitted through the air, so transmission requires close physical contact, making large-scale global spread less likely. But that said, low risk is not the same as no risk, and focusing exclusively on whether the virus reached Europe or North America misses the broader lesson. The deeper significance of this outbreak lies elsewhere. It is exposing the consequences of allowing public health systems to remain weak. It is exposing the difficulty of managing a disease in conflict zones. And it is exposing the risks created when international assistance is reduced before countries have developed the capacity to replace it. This is particularly striking given how recently the world experienced the COVID-19 pandemic. Most people remember the beginning of COVID. The reports from Wuhan, the lockdowns, the travel restrictions, the empty streets, the abrupt transition to remote work. What is remembered less clearly is the aftermath, the educational disruption, the psychological strain, the pressure placed on healthcare systems, the economic consequences are still being felt years later. The lesson from COVID was not simply that pandemics happen, it was that consequences persist long after the headlines disappear. And that lesson applies here as well. Eventually, this Ebola outbreak will cease to dominate the news cycle. Television crews will leave, international attention will move elsewhere. Yet the conditions that made the outbreak possible will remain. Weak healthcare infrastructure, population displacement, armed conflict, poor governance, limited state capacity. And if those underlying factors are not addressed, another crisis will eventually emerge. That is why the response cannot stop with emergency medicine and humanitarian assistance. There must also be a longer-term conversation about building resilient healthcare systems. African governments have a central role to play here as well. Recent discussion amongst African leaders have focused heavily on infrastructure and economic growth. And yes, both matter enormously. But healthcare is infrastructure too. A functioning healthcare system is every bit as important to development as roads, ports, or power stations. At present, a large proportion of healthcare spending across Africa still comes either from external donors or directly from citizens themselves, many of whom cannot easily afford it. So reducing that dependence will require greater domestic investment. It will also require governments to strengthen institutions, improve revenue collection, and tackle corruption so that resources are used effectively. None of that is easy, and especially not in a country facing the scale of challenges confronting the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But the alternative is to continue lurching from one emergency to the next. And that is perhaps the most important lesson from the current Ebola outbreak. The real test is not whether the world can respond to a crisis once it begins. It is whether governments and international partners are willing to invest enough to prevent the next one. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and join us next time for another 10 Minutes On.